they're taking evidence of abuse and calling it evidence of alienation. And judges are basically very drawn to alienation as an explanation for things, especially sexual abuse claims. They find it almost impossible, intolerable to conclude that a father sexually abused a child. They just don't want to do it. And so alienation gives them a beautiful invitation for another explanation, which to me is indicative of the denial, the thick wall of denial surrounding child sexual abuse. So it's remarkable how much you can kind of layer scientific sounding things onto something that is completely, really, it's really a core bias, and then convince an entire legal system of it. We call it a cottage industry because it's such a huge part of the custody litigation scene at this point. And many people are making a living off of the theory. It's an ideology, and the entire profession, the forensic part of the profession, has swallowed it.
Professor Meier, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
What is parental alienation?
So parental alienation was originally invented as parental alienation syndrome in the 1980s by a man named Richard Gardner. And he was particularly focused on child sexual abuse allegations by mothers. And he claimed that the vast majority, over 90% of them, were false when alleged in court. He had no basis for that data. That was impressionistic on his part. Parental alienation as a syndrome in the next 10 or so years became discredited, widely discredited, and Gardner was widely discredited. But out of the ashes of parental PAS, we call it, came the broader idea of parental alienation, which was claimed not to be a syndrome, but to still be a real dynamic and a real problem. And a lot more serious and credible researchers started building a literature around this idea. And I agree with your term that it's more structured, because it is really nothing more than the claim that abuse allegations are false when it's used in cases with abuse allegations. But yet it is described in much broader terms and discussed in much broader terms, as though there's a whole dynamic and a whole panoply of things that mothers do to try to wedge fathers out of the family in ways that they influence and essentially brainwash their children, and different ways to analyze the situation. There's a huge literature. There's a lot of research which is not really adequate research, but people rely on it and cite it, and the courts don't know the difference. And we call it a cottage industry because it's such a huge part of the custody litigation scene at this point. And many people are making a living off of the theory.
But just to play devil's advocate for a moment, for many people, are members of our audience who are not familiar with this theory, some of the claims seem like common sense. I mean, they think, okay, children lie, everyone lies, and surely you know of so-and-so, she filled the brains of this child with nonsense about that poor man, and you know, you hear things like that. And so how is this different to the sort of empirical impression that people may have from their surroundings or a couple of cases they heard?
I mean, I always argue that it isn't different. It's just a very elaborate, complicated, fancy way of saying what people think is common sense, which is that women are vindictive and they lie and they influence their kids, and, you know, and people lie when they're in angry divorces. You know, everyone knows a woman who was really vicious in a divorce, and that's what they draw on to believe this idea that this is happening. The difference here is that there's all this quasi-science pasted on around that intuition. And by the way, that intuition is very stereotypical and not particularly accurate. I mean, it's not that there aren't women who lie. Of course there are, but there's a lot of men who lie and nobody talks about them as a stereotype, particularly abusive men who lie virtually 100% of the time. And nobody talks about that as, you know, that's what's really going on here. So it's a very gender biased intuition and stereotype that parental alienation theory is built around. But yes, there's a lot of pseudoscientific language and pseudoscientific research built around this basic intuition, which I would argue is a biased intuition. Okay, so for instance, the more extreme members of the parental alienation field, such as William Burnett, Demosthenes Lorandos, who is not actually Greek, despite that name, and Jennifer Harman and Amy Baker, they all claim that there's a test that you can use to determine if someone is alienated, a child. And the test is these 5 factors that are basically drawn from the work of Richard Gardner, who you may recall I said was quite discredited, but nonetheless, these people have taken up some of the things he said and turned them into quasi-scientific things like a test. They have the 5-factor test, then they and these tests are completely subjective. They're things like the child previously had a good relationship with the father, or things like the child's hostility is not proportionate to anything negative that's happened with the father. But all of these things are like, how do you know? There's no objective way of knowing these things. And they present as though it's an objective test, but there's no objective way to answer any of it. And all of it is easily applied to situations where children were abused or witnessed the abuse of their mothers, have reasons for fear and avoidance of the father. And what happens with alienation theory in these tests is they take the facts and they interpret them their way, the same facts I would interpret my way. And they say, this is science. We have these facts and they show these factors and therefore it's alienation. Whereas I could easily say, these facts show that this kid was exposed to abuse. But because they have an article that says there's a 5-factor test, they make it sound like science, when it's completely biased, subjective. And it's very hard to explain this to judges. I've testified as an expert witness where I tried to explain to a judge that the expert, in that case, William Burnett, was taking evidence of a child's fear of their father and calling it evidence of alienation. And I said to the judge, they're taking evidence of abuse and calling it evidence of alienation. And I explained it over and over, and she could not grasp what I was saying. The judges have been convinced that alienation is a thing unto itself, and that when they diagnose it or label it, that there's something objective going on there. And when you try to say there's nothing objective, they're just taking the facts that show something else and saying it shows alienation, it doesn't go in. So it's remarkable how much you can kind of layer scientific sounding things onto something that is completely, it's really a core bias, and then convince an entire legal system of it.
These 5 factors, I mean, where do they come from? Are there some studies, say, on a number of children that support them? Or is there a way to, that at least they claim these factors can be proven? Even, I mean, is it empirical? Is it based on their own personal clinical practice? What is it?
It originally came from Gardner, and everything Gardner did was based on his own beliefs and clinical practice, not even clinical, forensic practice. So he just wrote all these ideas down. They then adopted these ideas, and then I think Amy Baker has done a study or so claiming to validate the factors, and I can't tell you enough because I haven't studied this particular piece of Baker's research. But the research of hers that I have studied that they rely on all the time for other points doesn't show what they're relying on it for. So the problem with these 5 factors is, even if they claim to have done a study and say that it means something, it's all circular. They're taking kids who are deemed alienated by the court, which is a subjective determination, and then they're saying, oh, look, they have these 5 factors, things like that. None of it, it's all self-referential. None of it is an objective outside assessment of whether in fact there was some other reason that the children were acting or feeling this way. None of it.
Yes, I mean, conversely, what would it take to prove that a child is not alienated, but is in fact feeling genuine fear because of abuse.
Right. So the only way we know to do that is to bring in an expert in that sort of abuse, to have them analyze the facts, and them educate the court on what is known about child sexual abuse, if that's what we're talking about, and how this child fits that awareness and that. And there's a fairly hefty research base behind what is known about child sexual abuse, and so those experts can cite to that. But the alienation people can just say, yeah, well, we have a hefty research base too, and we say this. And judges are basically very drawn to alienation as an explanation for things, especially sexual abuse claims. They find it almost impossible, intolerable to conclude that a father sexually abused a child. They just don't want to do it. And so alienation gives them a beautiful invitation for another explanation.
Well, I don't know the numbers in the US, but the Council of Europe has published numbers for the sexual abuse of children generally, not by fathers, but in general, putting the number at 1 in 5. This is including sort of more moderate forms of abuse, such as exposure to pornography or whatever, but still 1 in 5 is a huge number. And we have Institute of Child Health here in Greece, which is a research institute supervised by the Ministry of Health, that in its research, there's a number 1 in 30 for either attempted rape or rape by the age of 18, so until a child becomes 18. And at the same time, we know that about 90% of abuse perpetrators are close to the children they abuse. I mean, they're not strangers. Right. So that would put the number of fathers quite high, actually. I mean, you can't swear by the statistics, but I mean, it seems quite so. So why are they so reluctant to believe that it's not strange for courts to come across cases like this fairly often?
You are speaking empirically and objectively. Judges are reacting, it's like emotionally. They wouldn't necessarily admit this, but the idea is horrific, and they don't want to believe it of any one man standing in front of them, particularly a man who presents well and maybe even emotes, maybe even cries, seems to really love their children. They just won't go there. It is a very hard thing to convince judges of. And it is also very commonly characterized as sort of the nuclear weapon of child custody cases, and so the allegation. And so they're very quick, again, another gender stereotype, they're very quick to assume it's a strategy, it's the nuclear weapon, it's not actually real. And they will bend over backwards to interpret all the evidence in line with it not being true, and parental alienation gives them the way to do that. It is completely circular. Almost everything about the way parental alienation is used in these cases is circular, but the judges will accept it and don't really recognize that.
Okay, sorry, not to press the point too much, but I've got more questions. But this is something that really I haven't been able to get my head around all the time that I've been doing this. When we say this, when we say that a mother has come forth and she's supporting the child who is making a sexual abuse allegation, and she goes to the police or somewhere and makes a statement, and this is because she wants to deprive the father of his child. Now, presumably, this is a loving father, this is a caring father, and she is going through all of this and maybe gets herself in huge debt to pay huge legal fees, exposes herself to untold lawsuits that are coming her way for not keeping up with visitation obligations, for example, etc.
And denigration in court, like complete trashing in court, yes.
Yeah, what's the motive? I mean, what's she getting out of it?
She's vindictive. She's vindictive and she's crazy. I mean, a lot of women, I mean, there's this belief that women are hysterical and crazy. Now, this dates way back. There's a long history in Western civilization of characterizing women this way. And we used to never believe rape allegations on the same grounds. Women are hysterical. For instance, I only learned this about 10 years ago. The American Bar Association, back in the 1950s or so, I could be wrong on the era, but around, that long ago, but not ancient history, they published, they would have meetings on court policy, judicial policy. They published a commentary about rape allegations, including commentary by a psychoanalyst saying that women often claim this because they're sick, and therefore no allegation of rape should be considered seriously without a psychoanalytic evaluation of the woman. So the ABA publishes this under this is under the credibility of the National Bar Association, and that is informing the courts for decades further. So this claim, women used to be hospitalized in mental hospitals for being depressed or for accusing their husbands of things. So we have a very long tradition of suppressing, it's patriarchy, of suppressing women's complaints of what men are doing to women and children. And calling them hysterical is the go-to number one claim. Now we are in the modern era, and people think we don't do that anymore. Women are equal. We don't, demonize them the way perhaps we did in the past. But parental alienation, I've always thought this, but I've not written this in an article. Parental alienation is simply a modernization of the old patriarchal labeling of women. That's all it is, with a lot of scientific sounding language and scientific sounding research attached to it.
A modern, contemporary version of Victorian hysteria, so to speak.
Exactly.
Okay, so recently in Greece, it came to our attention that a senior judge who was giving a lecture to junior judges that were about to be promoted warned them that over half of child sexual abuse allegations are false. We know that this can't possibly be true because there's no research that says so in Greece. It's never been done. Nobody's done anything like this in Greece.
And there's contrary research around in North America.
Yeah, but I mean, it has been done in other countries.
Yeah.
So what can we say about this? Do children lie all the time just because they're children?
No, of course not. I mean, the idea there is that they're being brainwashed by their mothers. They're being put up to it by their mothers. They're maybe even believing it. They're coming to the point of believing it due to their mothers. That's the underlying idea. But the research in North America shows that well, let me put it this way. Nobody can objectively know the truth other than the child and the perpetrator or anyone who witnessed it. And so when you research the validity of these allegations, you're coming to a conclusion as best you can based on what you're finding. The research that's been done that relied on the opinions of child welfare people, child protection people, and some custody evaluators found that the vast majority of allegations were considered good faith, and a majority were considered valid, and about 30% or so were considered not valid, but not intentional false claims. And a lot of them were uncertain. So there's simply no basis for saying a majority of allegations are false. It's just fabrication from someone's head and from a false literature that makes these claims. I mean, there are little studies by people who want to deny the reality of sexual abuse, and they conclude often that in their little study of 18 people, that the majority of them were false. But there's a lot of problems with those studies they're not credible, and they're tiny. And the large studies that have looked at large numbers of children, even in cases, even children involved with litigation, have found otherwise. But they found it based on people's opinions. All of this is opinion-based. Nobody knows the truth, right? So even if you research it, you're trying to determine as best you can what's true.
Okay, let me ask about this. Is there a difference between a false allegation and an unproven allegation?
Yes, that's a huge issue. And the research is very consistent about that, there are as many as 1/3 of allegations that are unproven or can't be validated, but that they are not malicious and intentional. They are good faith mistakes, or we just don't know. And what happens often in court is that when the Child Protection Agency, comes out with a determination called unsubstantiated, the court treats that as meaning untrue. It doesn't mean untrue. It means we don't know. And yet we have an entire legal system treating that as though it means false. It's really bizarre how something as basic and simple as that, which every judge should know, and every caseworker should know, and everyone you ask should know, unsubstantiated doesn't mean false, and yet it's treated that way routinely, which to me is indicative of the denial, the thick wall of denial surrounding child sexual abuse. Every way we can, we will find a way to say it's false, even when, as you point out, objectively, empirically, it can't be false that often. It has to be true a lot of the time because of the numbers we know in the population, how much child sexual abuse is going on. And child welfare workers' unsubstantiation don't mean false, but we're going to treat them as false. And when children recant, it's often false, but we're going to treat it as true, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have an article that might be useful to you that I published in the Georgetown Law Journal, where I don't talk about only child sexual abuse, but I do have a section in there about denial and sort of the layers of denial and how the courts have to be coming from a very deep need to deny, unconscious need to deny child sexual abuse. It's not, I'm not saying every judge is knowingly refusing to believe it. It's much more that nobody wants to believe it and they glom onto whatever they can to not believe it.
Okay, but again, could unsubstantiated not simply mean that it doesn't meet the bar for criminal conviction? Fair enough, and that should be the case. We say that, you know, if there is a shred of doubt, we can't send the person to prison. But this is not the bar for any social response to this problem. For example, even civil courts have a different sort of standard. So child protection can't possibly have the standard of criminal law, can it?
So I would say there's 3 levels. Criminal court, beyond a reasonable doubt, shred of doubt, forget it. Child protection standard is even higher than custody, even if it's reasonably assumed to be lower than criminal. And the reason is child protection agencies are the state coming into a family and interfering in a family. And so we expect them to use a higher bar before we allow them to do that, to sort of disrupt a family from outside, from the state, and say, you're bad parents, we're taking the kid out. That's just a huge, huge move by the state. So we want the bar to be a little higher than just more likely than not. But in civil custody battles, it's more likely than not, preponderance of the evidence. It's one parent against another parent. It's not the state coming in and disrupting a unified family. And it should be an even lower standard to say, oh, I guess I'll rule to protect this child, even though I'm not positive what happened. There's enough evidence for me to be concerned. So there should be, even if child protection finds there's not enough for us to interfere, even then civil courts should be willing to protect children because they should be using a more likely than not standard. And even apart from more likely than not, custody courts don't need to prove that it happened. They just have to determine best interests of the child. So if there's a lot of smoke and they can't be sure about the fire, the best interest of the child is to reduce risk. And I've argued that over and over. It doesn't mean you have to prove the abuse to some level of standard. It just means the risk is there. It's a credible risk. I'm going to take steps to minimize that risk for this child. That, to me, is the best interest of the child. So, you know, I agree with your question completely, and I just add some nuance to it to say there are several layers of differentiation from the criminal standard, and yet we treat everything as though it requires a criminal standard. And by the way, the reason we do that, apart from the fact that we just don't want to believe it, is that well, it's part of the reason we don't want to believe it, is this idea I think courts have, and maybe even child welfare agencies have, if I find that abuse happened, this guy's going to jail. Like, they have this sort of thoughtless equation of what a civil authority finds with suddenly he's going to become a criminal. Well, it just doesn't work that way, actually. It doesn't. You know, a court may find whatever they want to find, and the prosecutors don't come swooping in. They don't track custody cases, and you know, and it's a different burden of proof. So, but I think courts, judges in particular, have this feeling of, I can't call him one of the worst kinds of criminal there is, so I'm not going to. I'm going to find some other way to see this case.
Could you just give us a sort of archetypal case? Like, what is a woman with a child faced with this parental alienation theory going through as she goes through the system? I mean, what's she facing?
It is perhaps even more traumatizing than what she's faced already by the abuser in the family, because it is the systematic denial of a reality that she and her child have experienced by people who supposedly hold authority and judgment and uphold right and wrong for the society. That experience of having the representatives of right and wrong in society reject your reality is deeply traumatizing. So that's the theoretical answer. The more concrete answer is, first she goes to court and she maybe alleges that there's been some abuse, perhaps child sexual abuse, and then she gets slammed with a parental alienation claim. She gets interviewed, typically by a custody evaluator. If the parties can afford to pay one, the court will often appoint them. The custody evaluator will do an interview with her, interviews with the children, interviews with the father, and then will write up a report and possibly testify. And in that, they will often characterize everything as parental alienation. They will often characterize her as hysterical or vengeful, or poke holes in every way they can. They will take the claims of the father, all of the ways that the father denies the mother's truth. They will take all of that at face value and parrot it forward as though it's objective reality in their own eyes. Fathers who abuse, many of them are really skillful at manipulating courts and court personnel and reframing. This is Jennifer Fried's theory of Darvo: deny, accuse, reverse victim and offender. They are really skillful at doing that by characterizing her as crazy, describing in detail crazy things she supposedly did, maybe describing her bouts with depression and anxiety or whatever. You know, women who find out their husbands were abusing their children can get enraged and do rageful things. They'll point to all of these things, ways that she may in fact have behaved, or ways that she never behaved, but he said she did, and then say she's crazy. So they're very good at doing that, and all they have to do is paint the image, and sometimes using parts of reality, for the entire system to turn against the woman because she's crazy. So the woman is facing, watching the abuser's abuse weaponized by the legal system and through the legal system, and given the seal of approval by the legal system. Then she's watching her child being forced into contact with a father who, you know, we're taking for granted that this is true in our hypothetical, who is abusing the child, and the child coming home from visits destroyed and taking days and days to recover and come back to who they normally are, and be capable of being loving and playful, or even functional again. And then she's having to force the child to go to visits every week or whatever. And the child is screaming and yelling and enraged at her for forcing them to go. So then she has to go through all of that. And then she gets attacked for any time that the child doesn't go, for contempt and withholding visitation. And yet at the same time, when there comes a trial or an assessment, she's told that the fact that, in the past, maybe at some point, she allowed visits is proof positive that she's lying about the abuse. And so it's there, you cannot win if you're a protective mother in these cases, because anything you do to sort of not get on the wrong side of the court, to try to appease, try to avoid an alienation label, to try to appease everybody by playing the game the way they want it played with the child's visits and stuff, that will be turned against you. Oh, furthermore, I've had cases where the mother testified calmly. The mother was a professional lawyer, the father was too. She testified calmly, and the judge's conclusion was that she was too calm and she couldn't possibly have been victimized the way she said, because of the, she's a professional and she testified without emotion. So, but when they testify with emotion, they're called, obviously hysterical and vengeful.
Yeah.
You cannot win.
These men, obviously, they have help. They have all these experts, sometimes psychiatrists, sometimes legal scholars. You referred to some of them before, and I told you before our interview started that some of them also get quoted here in Greece. US experts we've seen quoted in equivalent reports on parental alienation here. And the question is, if scientifically speaking, it's so evident that there's no merit to this theory, why on earth would you put your scientific credibility on the line like this? Like, why are you doing it?
Well, two reasons. One is it's not so evident, because most people don't think hard enough to understand what's wrong with the research that claims that it's true. It takes, a lot of peeling back of layers and careful thought and analysis to explain why the research is not valid. It's not self-evident.
The ones that do it, obviously, no. I mean, the ones that who are proponents of the theory, the most, so
they probably know. So okay, but maybe they know that the research they're relying on is false, or maybe they're true believers themselves. They're ideologues who have convinced themselves that the research is good enough to support something that they, and this is the other point, that they absolutely know to be true. Like, everybody knows there's such a thing as parental alienation. So the forensic experts, the judges, they're all like, well, even if the science isn't, ironclad, we know there's such a thing. So, and 2/3 of the profession says that there is. Oh, and by the way, there was a survey of members of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, the AFCC, which is the biggest family court network professional association in the US, and it's global actually. And they surveyed all the members, and many of those are mental health professionals, many are lawyers, many are judges. And they asked them, among other things, whether they believed that parental alienation is a form of family violence. And the vast majority said yes. So not only do they believe it's real, they believe it is the same equivalent as family violence. And that is, and so they've been using that more and more and more now in court to say that it trumps, it's as bad or worse than sexual abuse, than breaking your child's bones, than anything you can name in the form of family violence. It's become, it's an ideology, and the entire profession, the forensic part of the profession, has swallowed it.
There's been supposedly all this work in recent years to reorient child protection towards hearing the voices of the children. We have all this work behind child advocacy centers and what the optimal way of forensically examining a child is. And on top of that, we have, I don't know, I mean, the United Nations Special Rapporteur and the Grevio Committee of the Council of Europe, and, you know, which is serious people. And they are sort of making recommendations to member countries, you know, get rid of this, you know, get it out of your courts, train your judges, you know, in no uncertain terms. And I mean, they still go for this. It's like, how is it so difficult to make a dent in this?
You know, a lot of the international bodies that have made statements about this the U.S. pays no attention to. But so first of all, the special rapporteur was attacked as just another advocate, you know, completely biased feminist advocate. But I think, you know, and that's the extremists on the other side doing that attack. But I think that helps leave room for people who are not extremists, but who are judges, etc., who want to use alienation. They want to believe it. I mean, here's the problem. It has this kernel of reality. Parents do use children against each other sometimes. Parents do turn the children against each other sometimes. I mean, like, that's a reality that everyone knows has to be a reality, right? And they think that all that parental alienation is saying is that, yeah, this happens and it's really, really bad. It's as bad as family violence. And it's, you know, when women are claiming all these things, it's often false. And so it's easy to believe its validity, and it's hard to believe the validity of abuse claims. And then the third thing, and this is, again, my Georgetown article talks a lot extensively about this. You could call it patriarchy, but you could also say more nicely, which is what I try to say in the article, the system wants more active fathering in families. This is sort of the outgrowth of the women's movement and the movement for gender equality. The system really wants to see fathers given credit and given authority and parenting role in families. And so when they have a father fighting for parenting and a mother's objecting, that's just going the wrong direction. The system wants to reward fathers, wants to include fathers, wants more fathering for kids. There's an unstated, deep commitment to that. And it's somewhat stated in all the statutes that talk about equal custody, like you were talking about the new change in Greece. We have shared custody all over the place in the US. All of those statutes are trying to say fathers should be equal parents. We want that as a social policy. So when fathers are coming in and saying, I want to be an equal or more parent, and she's just this evil liar or crazy liar, the courts are like, of course, we want to reward you too. So I think there's the desire for more fathering and rewarding fathers. There's the denial and horror, like intolerability of thinking about child sexual abuse and believing an individual standing in front of you did it. And there's also the long history of demonization and sexist stereotypes about vengeful ex-wives and hysterical women. And I think all of that merges, and then you have this pseudoscientific ball of stuff that sounds scientific, and even if it's not perfected science, we all know there's a kernel of truth, so it's good enough.
One thing I wanted you to tell us something about is this, that we have started to also see here in Greece increasingly, that courts order children who have made sexual abuse allegations against their fathers to go through reunification sessions.
Right.
So supervised by psychiatrists who are appointed by the courts. This can happen in the context of civil litigation, but it can happen if the father has been acquitted of the charge in a criminal case. But sometimes we've seen it happen with the criminal case still open and pending. Like it's, say, through the process of criminal investigation, charges have been brought, but the father hasn't yet gone to court, and a civil court orders reunification. We know, I mean, a girl that we've been monitoring has to go through this tomorrow with her father. And we know there's been a lot of controversy in the US over reunification programs. Of course, they're a lot older there, and we've seen some really horrible videos and images of police grabbing children from their homes and stuff. Could you tell us a few things about this?
So what you have is courts being told by experts, and the court has no reason to disbelieve or distrust these experts. They present as being concerned for children and the best interest of children, and this reunification camp is the cure, it's the fix. And the judge is like, okay, let's do it. So that's how it happens. In terms of what they are, they're basically, they claim these kids have been brainwashed by the mothers. These programs are about brainwashing kids out of what they believe and have experienced. That's their agenda. That's what they do. They won't let them talk about the past. They absolutely won't let them talk about their reality, the truth. And they insist on their father's fine and wonderful and loves them, wants to be with them. And the kids learn, if they have a choice, they learn to go along to get out. And if they don't go along, if they stick to their truth, they're stuck in there indefinitely, and they can never see their mother until they sing the right song. And by the way, the other thing these camps require is the mothers are then told they have to recant. They have to tell the children they lied to the kids and they were wrong and their father's wonderful. And they have to write letters to this effect. And only when the whoever, I hate to call them experts, but the person, the professional put in charge of identification therapy says that the letter is adequate, only then can the children see the mother and the mother see the children. And there are mothers who've been interviewed who never got to see their kids because they wrote and revised and revised and revised. And in one case, I think it's Linda Gottlieb in New York, who said, no. And she could never see her kids. So they're giving people, some of these people are, I would say, crazy. I mean, you look at them and you could see how crazy they look. And the way they talk is pretty crazy. They're giving them total control over children and families. And they're all in the business of denial. And for instance, people like, I think Linda Gottlieb is one of them, who said in interviews, and I think it's published somewhere, video, says, I can tell if a child's truly been abused or not. I can just tell the minute I meet them. And these are the people that they're entrusting with kids. So it's like an extreme extrapolation of relying on junk science in court, is this incredible junk program that is being used, that's costing huge amounts of money and making the proponents tons of money.
So, Professor Meier, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good luck with what you're doing. Take care.